I just wanted you to all know that this webinar is going to be recorded. Secondly, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you to our partner and sponsor, IPEVO, makers of learning tools for a connected world, for supporting EdCan in delivering this series of high-quality virtual learning presentations. Please say hello in the chat and let us know where you're connecting from. This is my shout out from beautiful Rothsay, New Brunswick. A little on the chilly side today, I must say. I'm Max Cook, CEO of the EdCan Network. Since 1891, EdCan has maintained its tradition as the only national neutral third-party organization. We represent over 110,000 educators across Canada. Our role as an intermediary connects K-12 education systems across the country by producing and disseminating authoritative and evidence-based, yet accessible content that is trusted by educators, parents, and policymakers alike. A strategic priority for EdCan is to support K-12 educators in responding to emerging issues, challenges, and opportunities. And there's no doubt that preparing for a post-pandemic back to school is front and center. On behalf of EdCan and IPEVO, I'm so pleased to welcome such a broad cross-section of educators and other stakeholders from across Canada and around the world to this presentation and discussion today for Learning Our Way Out of a Pandemic, Beyond Back to Normal for Canadian Students. Like so many around the world, Canadians are looking with relief to a more open, carefree summer and a normal return to school in September. But is a return to normal good enough for our children or even possible? School closures and emergency online learning have widened educational inequities, and many students have lost ground, both academically and emotionally. Thought leaders around the world have begun to lay out proposals to build back better in education. Our presenters will share their examination of how Canadian schools have fared during COVID-19 compared to those in other jurisdictions, and what we can learn from COVID-19 pivots in schooling. They will then offer ways that Canadian schools can learn from global initiatives to ensure a better, stronger, and more equitable new normal come September. EdCan is privileged to feature two brilliant academics in today's presentation and discussion. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Karen Mundy. She's a professor of education, leadership, and policy at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto, Boise, UT. An expert on educational reform in lower income countries, Dr. Mundy is also an advocate and parent committed to improving educational equity in Canadian schools. Thank you very much, Dr. Mundy, for joining us today. Dr. Kelly Gallagher-Mackay is an assistant professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her past roles include research director at the Future Skills Center and at People for Education, and northern director of the Akitsarak Law School in Nunavut. She has two kids in public school as well. Doctors Mundy and Gallagher-Mackay plan to deliver a 20-minute presentation, followed by what we hope will be an extended discussion and answer period. When that time comes, simply type your questions into the chat after their presentation to keep the discussion flowing and to cover many of the concerns that you have regarding what will be another challenging September back to school season. I wanted to thank again everyone and thank you both for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thanks, shout out to my colleague Binta Diallo for all the work that she's done bringing all of us together today. Without further ado, Doctors Mundy and Gallagher-Mackay, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Max. It's really an honor to join the EdCan network and others who are, I believe, coming from all across Canada, and even a few for international folks I can see on our list. So welcome to everyone. I'm just going to launch off by saying that you know, we all know that COVID has created many challenges for our kids and for our schools, but of course it has also brought some silver linings. And so although we're going to launch into a presentation in which we first talk about some of the bleaker aspects of COVID, I think we're going to try to end on a more upbeat note. And I'll start off on an upbeat note just by saying that it's been a real pleasure for me during COVID to develop a greater awareness and understanding of Canadian education policy and to form new collegial working relationships with other scholars on this, including my fabulous colleague, Kelly Gallagher-Mackay. So I just want to start by saying that. I'm going to launch, I hope, seamlessly my screen, and you'll see a PowerPoint presentation shortly. My colleagues will tell me if I've done this correctly because I don't seem to be able to see it on my screen. Right. Are we good?
Nope.
Oh, no. Okay. So why are we not good? And what did we do last time? All right.
We just don't want you to see that what's coming up.
Yeah, I know, and I don't. This is the problem of new technologies always, that I'm going to have to stop sharing and try again. Folks, excuse me for this. So we did practice, but we are using an external camera from my Pivo for the first time, and probably not doing something correctly. All right, let's try again. X will switch to the presenter mode. Thank you, Justin. Yes, I'm getting feedback from audiences who are better tech users than I am. Thank you. All right. One more time.
There you go. There.
Did it work? Yes?
Yeah.
I have no idea why I pressed the same buttons. Hello, everybody, again. So now I feel somewhat of a technological idiot, which I think was the way many teachers and students felt for much of the last 14 months. Kelly's going to launch us off.
So I think that we know we've come together in a time that has been described as a generational catastrophe for education. And my guess is that most of you who have joined us are on the front lines of what that means in real classes and with students every day. Taking a very far pulled out vision of the picture, we realize that we've seen massive system-wide closures across the world, combined with a sort of rolling succession of educational policy reforms, including localized closures, transitions to remote schooling, and profound changes to school life, even where students are in person, whether that be cohorting and quadmesters, the loss of extracurriculars and sports, which are so important for student engagement, and constantly having to turn on a dime for both educators and students, even here in some of the richest countries in the world, with the most resources and strong, robust public education systems. This year has really shaken things up. It's shown us tremendous capacity to transform and pivot, probably beyond what anyone would have anticipated. And it has also provided nonstop challenges.
Kelly, one of the things that I just wanted to add to what you've said about this slide is that you can see here that actually North American schools were closed partially or wholly longer than schools in many parts of the developing world. And so this ability to pivot appears to have been more of a challenge in high income countries than in low income countries.
Yeah, and there's also been tremendous variation across Canada in terms of how much schools closed. So in Ontario and Newfoundland, we're looking at 40+ days of school closure. In other parts of Canada, we're very many fewer this year. So there's been a tremendous amount of variability across Canada, as well as in, in all of your daily lives. So this is a sort of a summary slide of some of the impacts of school interruptions, drawing on primarily international data, because one of the things we've really seen in our mapping our way forward is that there's a real lack of Canadian evidence around learning outcomes and student engagement and well-being outcomes. So we are constantly having to look to data beyond our own borders to try and figure out what is going on in our own system. So there's been numerous large-scale assessments of student performance in literacy and numeracy, and in some cases science. We looked at, I was part of a research team that's working on a brief for the Science Advisory Table in Ontario. We looked at 14 large-scale assessments, mostly from the US and UK, but also Netherlands and Belgium. And what we saw was that across the board in all of these assessments, there's been significant student learning loss, starting with the initial closures more than a year ago. We know less about what's happened this year, but of those studies that measured learning loss in months, what we see is that on average, students were losing, at about 2 months over the course of closures ranging to sort of the 3-month range. Perhaps one of the most striking comments was, sometimes it feels like students learned absolutely nothing during those initial periods of closure. I think there's been a lot of pivoting and a lot more learning happening this year, but the other key finding from these international assessments is that learning loss has been extremely unequal. And every different test looks at different groups who might be understood as disadvantaged, whether that be people who were in COVID hotspots, the Ohio study looked at, or whether that be racialized groups, some of the American ones looked at, English language learners, a California study looked at, kids in special education. Whatever axis of sort of traditional disadvantage you look at, the outcomes tend to be worse for those groups, and often like twice as bad or 3 times as bad. So in terms of what we know globally about learning outcomes, it's that there has been a significant decline in how much on average kids have learned over the past year, and that it has been unequal. And we saw that in a great big CBC survey, a national survey of teachers this week, where teachers were asked, are there some students who you're worried about their ability to recover? 70% of teachers were saying, yeah, there really are here in Canada. And we've jumped ahead.
Sorry, Kelly.
So the other thing I was going to say is that this matters for kids long term, right? You all know that. You wouldn't be educators if it didn't matter long term, if you didn't know that what kids learn today helps shape their future and the future of our country. So whether we look at that in terms of money or and estimates are in the $1.6 trillion of loss, not trillion, yeah, trillion dollars of Canadian GDP of loss in terms of what might happen if we don't find a strategy for building up the skills to kind of help compensate for some of this period of harm. So this really matters for our future as a country and for these students. We know we have some pretty good research from past disasters. Those gaps, they continue to mount. So what happens now makes a difference over the future, and whether that be that someone doesn't get as strong a basis in early learning, and we know that young learners have struggled the most. So then they're not necessarily reading to learn later, or whether that means that someone maybe winds up having a somewhat different set of streaming decisions happening as they transition into high school. These initial gaps have potential long-term outcomes for students that can affect graduation and post-secondary transitions. And we're really concerned to keep our eye on that long game, and we really need Canadian data to track what's happening to our students. This is a little bit of a sort of skinny model of some of the ways in which COVID-19 has contributed to worsening inequality in education. So the first thing is that, as we know, the disease itself has not been at all neutral. And we do have strong Canadian data that shows that low income and racialized populations are experiencing a higher burden of disease, which has translated directly to more stress and hardship, less in-person school, because guess which schools close with localized closures, and also stress from unemployment and other conditions at home that kind of radiates into the school life. We also know that students' family resources affect their connectivity and access to technology. A StatsCan study at the beginning of the COVID said that, you know, kids were likely to be sharing technology in lower income houses. Very few people don't have any, but if you're sharing, it's a lot harder. The limited research on online learning points to the fact that it is most effective with students who are already academically strong and motivated. So the mode of delivery is contributing potentially to worse outcomes, and changes in the home learning environment or differences in the home learning environment can change students' outcomes. There's a term that's been used for parents. I just saw a great study in Ed Researcher. The parents are proxy educators here in the context of remote learning. And parents get stressed when their kids are struggling, which creates a bit of the vicious cycle. So differences in parental background and the kinds of space and affordances of life to be able to study are going to play out in terms of kids' learning outcomes. So nobody on this webinar probably thinks that we already had a perfect education system. And I'm a huge supporter of Canada's public education system. I think it's a national treasure, but we had a long way to go in terms of really reckoning with and developing effective strategies to address inequality in Canada. We're one of the most equitable systems in the world. OECD data consistently says that. But race, disability, and family background still shape outcomes. And that was before. So that's why we're saying the normal isn't good enough. And this is a little bit more context on what normal has looked like. Canadian students are less likely to learn as much in their time in school, more likely to be suspended, and more likely to be in special education depending on their socioeconomic and racial backgrounds. So we still have some worries there. And this is a statistic Karen found from Montreal's, it's a
University of Quebec.
Université de Québec à Montréal. They've got a human capital lab, and they're pointing out that in many jurisdictions, a low-income student doesn't graduate from school with all the skills they need for successful transition to post-secondary, which is increasingly a prerequisite for a decent life.
So I think that's sort of the sad or the sorry story of
the bad news.
COVID's impact. And I'll just turn now to some of the ways that we can learn our way out of this pandemic. And I really want to put that emphasis on learning, because it seems to me that one thing that education systems themselves worldwide have not been so great at doing is learning. They evolve in a rather chunky way, perhaps without enough attention to learning from the past. I think Kelly and I are calling for an educational recovery strategy. We would love to see that at the provincial level in terms of the formation of an advisory body similar to the province's COVID science table. We think that in order to learn what to do, there needs to be fulsome consultation with key groups, educators, school boards, students, parents, and may I also add intermediary organizations, community organizations that provide very important supplements or complementary services to students who come from lower income or racialized communities. And we also argue in our article that other countries are far ahead of us in reimagining beyond business as usual. And so, for example, we have in the United States, the new Education Recovery Fund that works out to about 20, the financing works out to the equivalent of 20 extra days of schooling per child. And in the UK, a 1.7 billion Great Britain pound investment for priority education catch-up that is in fact being allocated to schools who can then purchase a range of supports to help kids who have been most affected by COVID. And in all of these international settings, what we see is a very strong emphasis on evidence, on trying to understand what works. So basically making sure that there is strong evaluative research around these interventions so that we can understand going forward where to place our public funding to try to close some of these gaps and inequalities in Canadian education systems. So there's a lot of evidence already out there on what works, at least from international evidence, and some from Canada as well. What we know on the do side is that Canadian educators and education policymakers should focus on starting where kids are. Asset-based approaches are really important when you come back from a pandemic, from a trauma, from the traumas that the kids have experienced. Slim down the curriculum. This is something well known in crisis contexts around the world. So really trying to slim the curriculum down so that kids focus on the mastery of essentials. And I might say also that they get the opportunity for deep learning and inquiry-based learning, not only rote learning. They've had a lot of that in their online and remote learning experiences, and they need a shift back to something that is both slimmer and at the same time deeper. Then balance academics with a strong focus on social and emotional learning. Again, something that we know well from trauma caused by crises in other settings and have perhaps less experience with in Canada, but I do believe that educators in Canada already pay a fair amount of appropriate attention to social and emotional learning. And then reinforce school connectedness, extracurriculars, athletics, creative projects, whole school events, any way that that schools can reach back into the family and the community. Some patterns already improved under COVID in terms of direct engagement with family members. And just to note that in a recent study from the OECD, Canada, represented mainly from data from Alberta, was shown to have much lower levels of parental engagement than many other OECD school systems, especially at the secondary level. Kelly, you want to take over the don'ts?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of cautionary notes that we need to pay attention to as well. So first of all, we shouldn't be assuming that even if we get back into school, that September 2021 will be business as usual. We do need to really be planning to have accelerated supports for students in school. And I think there have been a couple of recurring conversations that there's that flash educational warning signs. So one of which is responding to differences and a broader spectrum of learning capacities in students by streaming into permanent ability groups. There's a really robust research body on ability grouping in schools. And we know that students who might be struggling a little bit more have depressed achievement if they are consistently subject to peer groups and instruction aimed at lower achieving students. The mix matters, and we need to try and really actively preserve that going into 2021. But that means that we need supports for teachers to be able to do it. And the other thing where there's very strong international evidence is on repeating grades. It's one of the biggest push out factors in schools. And there would be really a lot of reason to be concerned if the suggestion is, let's just go back and do it again. Students want progression and moving forward, and they benefit from that. So that puts all of those don'ts put a lot of pressures on classroom teachers, and that should be clearly acknowledged. But I do think it's really important that as we go forward, we don't backslide and do things that the evidence points us away from, as well as paying attention to sort of providing those supports in play.
One of the sort of lessons from the pandemic is really just how important homeschool community connections are and have been during the pivots to remote learning. There's a lot of international evidence about ways that tech tools have helped to facilitate two-way homeschool connections. And so as an example, we know that many countries have introduced regular text messages out to parents, just giving them a little guidance about how to support their kids in their learning. And these have been shown in randomized control trials to actually improve learning outcomes for kids and families that receive them. So I think there's some ways in which technology has been our friend, even though overall it has, I think, resulted or demonstrated just how weakly connected kids are through technologies and how unevenly connected they are. And then providing resources to schools that actually enable schools to build these stronger networks with community agencies and other, sorry, there's a plane flying over my house, other community agencies and partners. In Quebec, for example, the school community learning centers are funded with positions to convene partnership tables and bring resources into schools. And I think Kelly, this is a study that Kelly has followed and has shown in her own work, actually yields enormous benefits well beyond the cost of resourcing these positions. And then relationships with mental health agencies and positive sort of mental health messages and supports are going to be very, very key in the context of the pandemic and the pandemic recovering. One of the areas that Kelly and I have been working together on is the area of tutoring and academic support programs. So internationally, what we can see in Australia, in the UK, in the Netherlands, and in the US are large government investments to enhance one-to-one support for kids coming back into a more into face-to-face instruction, especially those kids who come from communities most affected by the pandemic or who are already underserved in our education systems. And just to say that these programs, including things that we're already familiar with, summer learning programs, after school homework programs, but especially direct one-on-one tutoring have been shown to be highly effective. So this very significant body of evidence shows that these small group tutoring or one-on-one supports really can close inequality gaps or gaps in student learning. And not only in the early grades where there's a robust body of evidence, but increasingly we're seeing that these learning inequalities gaps can be closed if we target resources at secondary level as well. In Canada, we've got literally hundreds of community-based organizations offering free tutoring and academic support programs for underserved communities. But to date, only Quebec has announced a major investment in online tutoring. Just one final thing, even really simple programs to support kids have been shown to work. And I just like to highlight a very simple program that was used in Boston, just sending out an age-relevant book to families over the summer month with some simple instructions about having the kids read those texts to their parents, showed a really quite remarkable positive impact on kids' readiness, reading readiness when they returned, and so helped to staunch what is called in the research literature the summer slide. So just thinking outside the box about different kinds of often low-cost interventions that can help kids, as well as some of these more systematic interventions like one-to-one tutoring or academic support programs is important. So what makes for really high quality academic support and tutoring programs? Here's what the research tells us. Strong evidence suggests that frequency matters, so at least twice a week, that the tutors themselves, even if volunteers or paraprofessionals that their training is important, linking the tutoring to the school curriculum, using a structured approach, by which we mean having a kind of curriculum where kids are learning to master specific concepts that are difficult. And then, of course, as we've emphasized throughout, the social and emotional learning, having somebody who's on your side, a mentor, building a sustained relationship with other students. One of the most fascinating pieces of literature that I've read this year was by sociologist Shetty, and he found out that kids that were lived in underserved and neighborhoods in the US who were offered the chance to network with people from outside their neighborhood to build that kind of bridging social capital actually went on over their lifetime to build stronger careers and even stronger scientific innovations. But we have a lot more evidence needed. And I think in Canada, where we have really quite limited evidence of efficacy of the various community-based programs, we really should be investing in evidence building, not just running out and launching a lot of new programs, but making sure that we partner this with evidence about what works best. The wider literature tells us that we really don't know enough about where to target these kind of academic support programs. If we have not enough dollars to fund it at all grade levels, are there some transitional periods or some groups of kids with special needs that need this more than others and can benefit better? We know very little about the benefits of and the efficacy of online tutoring, and should we continue it post-pandemic, because it is an easier way of delivering tutoring, especially from volunteers, but it can be may have some of the downsides of online learning are embedded in it. We don't know as much about the efficacy of volunteers or of peer-to-peer tutoring. In Canada, we have several organizations that specialize in teaching kids in high school to peer tutor others. We just don't know enough about how efficacious these are, but I think they're very promising. So we'd like to have more evidence. The balance between mentorship and coaching and a more academic focus for tutoring. We know not enough about that. And then the overall challenge of community-based tutoring versus school-based academic support programs is something where we need more evidence. Kelly?
Yeah, we wanted to talk a little bit about a project we've undertaken with support from the Future Skills Center and the Diversity Institute at Ryerson to try and build a research collaboration and community of practice, bringing the research community a little bit closer to the people doing the work on the ground of community-based tutoring. So we've got a couple of projects underway with this support, one of which is an ecosystem mapping just locally in Toronto to get us started, looking at the community-based tutoring and academic support programs and what are their characteristics? How does it line up with what the research evidence tells us? We've been creating an evidence summary on effective tutoring, and you've just heard the highlights of it from Karen. And our next direction is towards building a community of practice to share what we know about evidence and what's working. I think one of the other big unknowns is what's the impact on tutors themselves in doing this kind of work. There's some tremendous potential for service learning for youth, which, when I look at it, I look at the possibility of broadening the scope of students applying to ed schools to become teachers for life. I think there's a lot of potential for students to learn a lot about really important future-oriented human skills through doing tutoring work, whether that be high school students or undergraduate students, to help strengthen our education system and the pipeline into our system as well. So we're really excited about this research collaboration and the work we anticipate hopefully gathering some momentum from us. We're still at the fairly unexciting stage of it, but it's going to be out in the world soon, and we think it's going to be really exciting research.
And then just in the meanwhile, let me just say a shout out, because so many colleagues from University of Toronto are online here, to say that at OISE at University of Toronto, we've launched a partnership with the TDSB where we're trying to harness graduate teacher education students and graduate students to provide high quality academic support to kids in underserved neighborhoods. It's going great. And also Ryerson's Diversity Institute has a slightly different model model program underway called Study Buddies. And so, just a shout out to all of those in the school boards and in the schools and also in the communities that have been trying to build this kind of support from the ground up during a pandemic. And then some final thoughts. I think one thing that we know for sure is this is not the last time we face a serious disruption to schooling in Canada. I hope it's the last time we have a pandemic in my lifetime, but certainly one thing that we've learned is that a level of preparedness was not there for such disruptions. Educators, all of you have learned a lot about resilience, and I think all of us have many significant lessons to share. I'd like to see more out there about those lessons. What have we learned that we can really build on? Also, what have we learned that we could hospice or put aside from what we've done in our schools and in our school community interactions? It's going to take a lot of energy, effort, all hands on deck, but in particular, we need our systems, our education policy leaders to provide dedicated resources to support a more intensive collaboration and better evidence if we want to make sure that this crisis doesn't make inequality worse. And finally, we really owe it to our kids to aim higher than a return to normal. So thank you, everybody, and we'll look forward to responding to some of your questions in chat. I don't know, Kelly, if you've been tracking chat at all.
Well, there's just been a sudden explosion of
and feel really welcome. If as I said, most of at the beginning, a lot of my work has been in low and middle income countries. So I'm also happy to respond to sort of comparative questions.
All right. So when I'm looking, the first thing I see is a couple of logistical questions. That's my understanding that, and you can hear a little bit more from our hosts, but that there will be a recording of this session available on the EdCan website in the next few days. And our article is also available for sharing through the EdCan website. We'll see. I'm sure it'll be posted. The link will be posted again at the bottom of the chat. We've got a question, Karen. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about the partnership with the TDSB, whether it's through teacher candidate placements or otherwise.
Well, if you're interested, email me. We are looking for more volunteers. We're planning to continue the program into next year. There's pretty significant demand from right now. We started working with the virtual secondary school in TDSB. That school has about 17,000 students. I think it's the biggest high school in human history. And now we've just sort of ironed out some of the kinks. It's an online tutoring initiative. It's got some challenges. I would say that we're learning by doing. But it's really been, I think, touching to me to see what value the kids themselves are getting out of the tutoring when I go in and visit the different sessions happening. And also, just another pitch, we are trying to get a good ecosystem map of all of those organizations providing tutoring services. Or after school or academic support programs. So please, if you are one or you know of one, please feel free to shoot me an email, because we would love to send that survey out and enrich the ecosystem mapping.
And that's a Toronto request.
that is a Toronto specific request, although I think Kelly and I want to go province-wide and then nationwide in building this community of practice eventually. Yeah, it is. And by the way, the program is using, we are using teacher candidates, but not only, also graduate students. And, you know, in our vision, what we'd like to be able to do, and we spent a lot of effort trying to support development of tutor training materials so that we could actually engage undergraduates. Because I think what we're talking, you know, we're probably reaching about 500 kids now. And what we'd like to reach is more like 2,000 or 3,000 kids. And ultimately, I think Kelly and I were doing a back of the envelope, and we decided that probably, this is what the superintendent of the virtual secondary school told us, probably about a quarter of kids need this kind of academic support coming back after the pandemic.
So there's a question that might be a little outside our area, which is what good things have been learned about remote learning that could be used going forward in the classrooms. I'm not super comfortable answering that question myself, but I see that some members of some participants in this webinar have added some commentary in the chat, and I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add, Karen.
You know what, if some people are asking me for my email, but if you'll just Google me, karen.mundy@utoronto.ca, you're going to find it very easily online. Thanks. Something about just to say that I have a colleague who's been doing a survey of lower middle income and lower income countries about how they're responding to the pandemic. And in fact, she's finding in the majority of countries, they are also initiating some kind of academic support or tutoring program. So it's not just in OECD countries that this is happening, it's happening everywhere.
Okay, so we got a couple more questions. Thoughts on getting districts, and I would say particularly ministries of education, to fund more support in classrooms, whether that be for smaller class sizes or additional people in the secondary classroom. I mean, the truth is that as educators, I think we have a real job to do to advocate for our students and to talk about why this is going to make a difference. We have to accept the fact that there are problems that have come from the necessary response to the pandemic, and that we need additional supports and that they can be effective. I think being well informed about what we're asking for and making the public case. My old job at People for Education, we used to talk about the fact that policy is made through public conversations. And you as educators, we've heard a lot from the doctors about the harms associated with the pandemic on kids and the harms of school closures. We haven't heard as much from the general education community, and I would really encourage you to advocate for this kind of support as being an essential part of making sure that the pandemic recovery strategy is really inclusive of youth and prioritize youth who have indirectly been very deeply affected by this pandemic. So there's a question, Karen, about recommendations around a holistic approach to interventions, focusing on a mix between academic and well-being to ensure that we're supporting the whole child. Do you want to talk to that?
I think I'm just going to refer people to the Annenberg Center at Brown University for some super helpful tip sheets on social and emotional learning post-pandemic. I haven't seen a resource that's better suited to Canadian educators in my reading. But also just to mention that, you know, it's a two-way street, I suppose. And one of the things that's puzzled Kelly and I a little bit is a lot of the pushback from especially Canadian educators and American educators about learning loss. And when we talk about learning loss, we're not, perhaps I think people associate it with test-based accountability, which is unfortunate. What we're really trying to highlight here is the fact that the gap, the inequalities in assets that kids have for learning grow during a pandemic like this, and probably have been exacerbated. And so, just keeping in mind that kids gain confidence not only by being supported socially and emotionally, but also by being able to demonstrate mastery and progress in their own learning. So these things are a two-way street, and making sure that it's going to be a very delicate balance, I must say, for teachers, because while Kelly said, please don't start streaming your kids and labeling them and stratifying them when they come back. At the same time, in order to respond to what's going to be a lot of variation in your classrooms because of the variation in home experience, you need to find ways to teach a curriculum in a very differentiated way so that you can bring those kids back into the mainstream of your teaching. So we're all trained as educators to do differentiated instruction. It's one of the hardest things to do, especially in a class of 36. And that is why I think these one-to-one tutoring or academic support programs are helpful, because they help the teacher to do that individualized support that sometimes in a classroom are very difficult. Yeah, Kelly, is there anything else?
No, I completely agree with all of that. We had a question about the concept of school connectedness, and I do think it's really interesting to look at what the research literature says about school connectedness. It's heavily associated with major and positive impacts on well-being. So higher self-esteem and life satisfaction, lower substance use, participation in fewer risk-taking behaviors, likelihood of graduating, greater feelings of positive mental health. School connectedness really matters for kids. And again, at the risk of sort of piling one more things on educators as professionals, I do think that thinking about the kinds of elements of school life, such as extracurriculars and whole school events that we've kind of had to put on hold for the emergency, making sure that's built into the recovery as an essential part of supporting students' well-being. That's a great place for students to have some choice and some self-expression, and to do some collective learning. So I hope that when we're looking forward to fall and trying to figure out, in a more vaccinated environment, what can students do, that we really are attentive to those opportunities where students coming together within the sort of embrace of their school community have a chance to do some creative learning. From a 21st century skills perspective, those areas have always been among the most important. They're places where students really identify themselves as being able to sort of figure out what they want and have control over their learning. They're highly associated with creativity as well as social emotional well-being. And so, again, more to advocate for, but it is a problem that we have funding formulas where that's all left to educators to do in their spare time. But I guess I just want to give a shout out to all those of you who do make the time to do that. It's so important for students' well-being and sense of school as something bigger and part of their civic life.
I would just also add that, somebody asked, like, well, we're just individuals. Aren't there some sort of organized forms of civil society that can help us along? And I think we have seen a very active efforts by teachers unions, especially and different parents associations, teachers unions, and civil society organizations like People for Education, advocating, for example, over the last couple of weeks against what I think we have to be very, very careful about calling a split attention model for the fall versus a hybrid model. These are two different things. Split attention is a teacher trying to teach remotely and in the classroom at the same time with 30 kids, half online, half face-to-face. That's probably not going to work. Whereas hybrid models, there might be something in the hybrid model that actually has worked. We just, unfortunately, we didn't do any evidence or data gathering during the pandemic to know how well this experiment works. So if we continue it and we're a bit more stable in the fall, I really hope boards and the ministry will try to find out what about these hybrid models with kids doing part of their learning online and part in the classroom. What about flipped classrooms where instruction is, face-to-face instruction is concentrated on deep learning, project, collaboration, and more of the rote learning is done online? We really haven't done much to experiment and understand these strengths and weaknesses of these just different ways of teaching. I'm pretty sure by 2050, we're going to be in a very different world with this kind of blend hybrid learning. Knowing now what works best for kids, or starting to know now what works best for kids coming out of the pandemic, especially, I think when we're at least a little bit acculturated to using online learning, it would be a great time to do that. Not a great time, in my humble opinion, to move to the model that Ontario has suggested of online learning being offered on a commercial basis through TV Ontario, and then school boards buying those services back. That doesn't seem like the right thing to me, but then not sort of, and understanding that face-to-face instruction is so important, but still trying to get some of the gains out of hybridity or flipped classrooms. I think that's definitely got to be in our wish list for the future for our education systems. But let's move through evidence, dialogue, delicately.
Yeah, and I think there really is a challenging conversation to have about research in schools. It pretty much got shut down this year. We didn't have, in a lot of provinces, we didn't have even basic data collection on how students are doing. And to be able to monitor the impact of interventions to try and support students, usually you want comparable baseline data. And we lost that for the last 2 years in Ontario. I think BC continued it, but most of Canada shut down many of our basic research mechanisms. And that is a pity, because if you want to figure out where services are most needed, if you want to figure out whether you're succeeding in closing gaps and you haven't measured them initially, it's not the most evidence-based approach to learning. And I think when we look at sister areas like health, it's kind of shocking how long it takes us to know what's going on in our schools. It is disturbing that we don't have Canadian data on our own students. And that I think that's put us behind the 8 ball in terms of understanding what works for how we intervene. And it may also have muted political pressure for investment. So I would encourage you to not hate the idea of at least sample testing to find out how kids are doing in a range of ways. Push by all means for broader understanding of students' progress, but we should be getting scaled data on student success in an ongoing way, and much, much faster than we do right now, if we really want a learning system that can keep evolving.
So I see just a reminder that there is a draw of one of these Pivot. They're document cameras, but they turn out to work pretty swell for presentation, as you can see by looking at Kelly and I. So the winner will receive an email. So just so you know, they're going to do a draw from everybody who's still here, and you'll receive an email. The winner will receive an email. I don't know if there's 1 or 2 winners, but anyway, it's a nice perk for the webinar.
I saw maybe one last question about, is there anyone who says that this isn't a time for big educational change going into September, that slowing down and deepening practice? I think change is inevitable. Whether we're doing major new initiatives is a different question, but change is coming. And so I think that there's a lot for educators, for all of the stress facing people in the profession this year. There's really a lot to be proud of in terms of how much change has been coped with, and in some cases really led to tremendous successes in the year behind us. And I hope that gives confidence for future changes, maybe some a little more planned.
I would just say that if you don't follow him already, Jal Mehta at Harvard has, is a kind of continuous voice of reason around this idea of, deep learning, going back, really examining how can we sort of slim things down and then keep a focus on social and emotional learning and deep instruction, inquiry-based instruction in the fall, rather than trying to, ram curriculum down the throats of our students as they come back from what has been, a very significant trauma in their lives. I know I'm sitting at home with all my kids, and I know that they're just the loss of social and emotional loss of engagement with others, of peers, has been a huge cost to their well-being. Okay, use of data.
I see a question from David Montemuro about the downsides of data. And I think it's important to really distinguish between test-based accountability and data use. I think sample-based, low-stakes check-ins on how people are doing are a really useful and important part of learning. I think we've seen some really positive, not to be terribly Ontario-centric, but it actually really helped make the case for de-streaming, to have years of data about how students' outcomes were depressed by being put in applied classes in high school. And it has really helped push to decrease congregated special education systems. So it's really about getting that data into use with a critical lens and not using it to rank and order schools and students. It's hard work, but resisting all data collection isn't, this is totally my view, but I don't think it's helpful. Data alone isn't enough. It's the only thing. Our province has sort of said they're $20 million, less than $20 million for learning loss next year, is a real concern. And most of that's supposed to be spent on diagnostic assessments for early years. Well, if it's data without some support that flows from the answer, that's not good enough. So data is necessary, but not sufficient. That would be the other thing I'd say on the critical literature.
In international education, there's a big debate about test-based accountability. And so systems that are more about accounting versus systems that are more about accountability. And they're very different things, right? One is about just measuring so that you can tick a box, and the other is about trying to use evidence and data in a way that actually allows people to puzzle through what are pretty complex problems, and to make sure that they can iterate and adapt what they're doing to rise to the challenge of those problems. And so I guess Kelly and I share a view, for example, that the thing that we wished governments across Canada had done this year was do a very small but representative sample, for example, of reading progress among kids, so that we would be able to say more proactively, speaking outside of politics, outside of formal school systems, we as a community could have said more effectively, look, you know what, this $20 million in Ontario is a ridiculous sum, because we can see that kids are not where they might normally have been, social emotionally, or in terms of sort of some learning benchmarks compared to past years. Tyranny of the curriculum, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Megan and I were at the same event where somebody talked about the tyranny of the curriculum, that is trying to sort of stuff everything into a smaller and shorter period of time. And that's just teachers really know that's not going to work. So I think teachers who try to do that are going to end up very stressed out. But having some system guidance about how to slim the curriculum, how to keep that focus on deep learning, how to coach and mentor kids post-trauma. I think all of these things are things we might reasonably look to our education systems to provide. And they're not the kind of things that have been forthcoming from our ministries and boards this year. So I think that's a big disappointment, to be honest. I think that we've pretty much covered all of the questions, Kelly.
Yeah, I think we have.
So
And I
colleagues at EdCan, is there any way you want to
see Max unmuted himself, which means the hook might be coming.
I think I can speak for everyone that the insights you shared today were fantastic, helpful, and I think draw upon so much of the evidence, and we have so much more to learn as we move forward in this. And I just want to, on behalf of EdCan and IPEVO, our sponsors of these wonderful cameras, you came in beautifully and clear. I'd love to have one of those myself, actually. Thank you very much for your time today, and thank you everyone for participating. I think there's a lot of links that were shared, and we will capture those as well in a follow-up to everyone who attended today, as well as this webinar being available shortly. Thank you to Binta for all your work in making all of that happen. Really, really pleased. And I think we could probably do a follow-up on this in the future to see how things are moving along. So your magazine article is up and online, and the May issue of Education Canada, Back to Normal, ? Is going to be, the flip book is going to be released shortly. So with thank you very much, Drs. Mundy and Gallagher-Mackay. I'm having a hard one with that today, I have to tell you. I'll get it right sometime. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, IPEVO. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. We will be following up with more information. All the best.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.